Yes, you have gone hook, line, and sinker supplying commodities to a price-insensitive Chinese market. And yes, as China breaks down, you're going to feel that. That's unavoidable. But you have far better relations with the nations of Southeast Asia, which collectively are going to pick up a lot of the pieces that the Chinese are going to drop as their industry collapses. They're not as price insensitive. It'll be slower growth, but it'll be more sustainable and more healthy moving forward. That is also a good story. I would also say there's an opportunity here for Australia to do something that it has shunned doing until now, and that's moving up the value-added scale yourself. A lot of those materials processing that the Americans are so paranoid about, guess who's got the raw materials? Guess who has some of the cheapest energy in the world? There's no reason that Australia can't play a role in upgrading the lithium and everything else that the modern world is going to need. And you also have the skill sets to do it. And you can even do it in green power in a way that we can't do it in the United States because your solar potential is so huge. So there are a number of things that suggest to me that we are looking at another couple of solid decades of growth for Australia. If you can get past that financial crisis, you've got to chew through something that's roughly 3 times as bad as what the Americans went through with subprime. And there is no way I can imagine that you're going to do that without a recession. As the world has aged demographically, capital has been available at greater volumes with greater ease at lower rates than any time in human history, and that pretty much defines the last 15, 20 years. And now the people who generated all that capital, the baby boomers as they were moving towards retirement, are moving into retirement. And so the capital costs were always going to skyrocket about right now and continue rising at least into the mid-2030s. We have 15, 20 years of incredibly cheap capital that we now have to process through. And if you look at just the raw data, the United States is probably okay. We seem to have at least learned most of the lesson from the 2008 financial crisis, but Australia hasn't. Australian credit has risen by a factor of 7 since the year 2000. In the case of India, you're talking about 14. In the case of China, you're talking 34. So the idea that we can kind of let the air out of some of these financial bubbles without them popping is probably a bit of a stretch, but the story is absolutely not going to be the same everywhere. This is weird. So I'm not a big fan of the Biden administration's economic policies writ large, but this is one where I think at least they've got the spirit right, even if they've got some of the details wrong. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is a dumb name for what it actually does, seeks to build out processing capacity for a lot of the technologies and especially a lot of the base materials that are required in order to do the green transition. Now, I'm a green, but I'm a green that tends to get uninvited to parties because I can actually do math, and I call people when they're saying bullshit. In the case of what's going on with the Biden administration, though, we are the sunniest first world country after Australia, and we are the windiest first world country. So there is a lot of room in the United States in an economically viable manner to expand our green tech footprint and splice it in with everything else we do. Now, there's 1,000 caveats in that statement about the wheres and the whens and the hows and the how fasts. I think that's a good starting point. The weak point in the American green tech industry is we produce almost none of the base materials and even less of the processed materials. So once the lithium is basically mined and concentrated, it then needs to be turned into lithium metal. That processing step from the powder to the metal, none of that's done here. Very little of the copper harnesses are done. Almost no of the nickel processing is done here, and on and on and on and on. And if I'm right about China, we're going to lose the location that does most of the processing. And guess what the country is in the world that does the second most processing? Russia. So the idea that there's a few $100 billion floating around in the American system to chase after industry to do this at scale in North America, I think is a grand idea. Once you get out of the weeds, you will find things you don't like. But overall, remember, this is the first industrial policy the United States has had since the 1940s. The advantage we have on the American president right now is that he was a full grown-ass man in the 1940s. He remembers how that went. He's the only person alive right now who does. And so it makes sense that he's the first person to come up with an industrial policy since then. Well, let me give you four. The first one, and by far the most significant, is the demographic collapse. As countries industrialize, they move into the cities and birth rate drops. And the same time that happened in China, starting in the late 1970s, the Chinese also instituted the one-child policy. So you had economic trends crashing the birth rate at the same time as the government forced it down even further. And now in major cities across China, the number of births per woman is below 0.8, which is a historical low for any country in any era. And we're looking at a complete loss of the working class in China in under a decade. And there's not an economic model that works with that at all. So that's number one. There's no negotiating on that one. You can't fix that. Second big problem is that Chairman Xi has executed or exiled or imprisoned everyone within the PRC who's capable of independent thought, and no one wants to bring him information anymore. So if you were going to attempt to have a more dynamic system that thinks forward, thinks ahead, they don't have that anymore. They may have had it at one point, we can debate that, but it's gone now. And you basically have one guy making policy in a box and everyone afraid to tell him anything because they don't want to be the next messenger that's shot. That's not a great thing to do when your country is facing critical problems. Number three, the financial sector. When the United States got into trouble in 2008 with subprime, we had doubled total private credit in 8 years. That was too much too fast. China has increased their credit by a factor of 34 in 20 years. There is no country in history that has gone up this far, this fast, ever, and survived doing 1/3 of that volume. So you want to talk about a financial crisis, it will be centered in the People's Republic, and the economic sector that is most exposed in China is agriculture. So not only do you have an industrial bust to go with the financial bust, you might even have famine. And that brings us to the fourth thing. China imports 3/4 of their energy. 3/4 of that comes from the Persian Gulf or further beyond. And they import over 3/4 of the inputs that are required for them to grow their own food. They are the country most dependent upon international trade simply to exist. And whether it's the Ukraine war or spat in the Persian Gulf or the Americans going on the warpath or simply internal political incompetence, which is now rising every day, this doesn't work, not in a non-globalized system. So China is going to flame out just as impressively as it flamed on. And we're all going to remember it for a good long time. Oh my God, I wish I had a good one for you. What I can tell you is that most Russian crude, about 70%, is produced in the permafrost. And because the Russian demographic is terminal, and because the Russian educational system collapsed 30 years ago, there's only a very small cadre of skilled workers that are actually trained up to do the work in the permafrost. And they're on average in their late 50s now. So there's not a lot of them. They're literally dying out. And without Western tech and above all else, Western workers, the ability of the Russians to keep this stuff flowing is very much called into question. And that's before you consider war, sanctions, or boycotts, all of which are having their own impact. So we need to plan for a not too distant future when Russian crude exports just aren't there. Now, in that scenario, especially if it happens suddenly, we're going to have a significant price shock around the world. And then you have to look to Washington. Because in Washington, the American president has the authority to end oil exports with the stroke of a pen. It doesn't have to go to Congress. That authority was already granted back in 2015. And since Biden is the most economically populist president we've ever had, there is no way he is going to expose the American consumer, the American voter, to high and volatile global prices if he doesn't have to. So the question just isn't when will the Russian stuff go offline? It's how much American stuff goes on offline with it. And if the world loses American and Russian crude at the same time, you're probably looking at crude prices never dropping below 150 again. And you're probably looking at a captured price in North America where they never rise above 70 again. Probably. There's a lot of ifs and statements linked to that prediction.